Welcome back, criminophiles, to another episode of Homicide Cases. I'm your host, Misfit.
I'm John Armstrong, an American serial killer convicted of 5 homicides, but I confessed to 18.
The clinical and forensic profile of John Eric Armstrong, development trauma, and the geographic mobility of a serial predator.
The criminal trajectory of John Eric Armstrong, who would become known in forensic literature as the baby doll killer, presents a singular case study in the intersection of childhood developmental disruption, adult psychiatric maladaptation, and the tactical exploitation of military-grade geographic mobility. Convicted of 5 counts of homicide in the Detroit metropolitan area in 2000, Armstrong's case is further complicated by a series of unconfirmed global confessions involving 13 additional victims across 3 continents. To understand the mechanism of Armstrong's descent into serial homicide, it is necessary to examine the longitudinal progression of his life, beginning with the foundational traumas of his early childhood in North Carolina and concluding with the high technology forensic investigations that eventually secured his permanent removal from society.
Etiological foundations and early developmental trauma.
The psychological genesis of John Armstrong, born on November 23, 1973, in New Bern, North Carolina, is inextricably linked to a series of catastrophic domestic events during the late 1970s. In forensic psychology, the presence of severe early childhood trauma is often a precursor to later dissociative and antisocial behaviors. For Armstrong, the pivotal fracture point occurred in 1978 when he was just 5 years old. His younger brother, Michael, died at the age of 2 months from sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS. The impact of this loss was immediate and profound. Clinical records indicate that Armstrong attempted suicide shortly after his brother's death by riding his bicycle into a busy, populated street, a clear behavioral manifestation of survivor's guilt, or a desire for fraternal reunification. This early association of death with a longing for proximity may have served as the primordial seed for his later necrophilic paraphilia, where he sought permanence in his victims because in death they would always be there. The domestic stability of the Armstrong household further deteriorated following Michael's death. Armstrong's father, John Armstrong, abandoned the family shortly after the funeral. During his later confessions, Armstrong alleged a history of extreme physical and sexual abuse at the hands of his father, claiming that both he and his mother were victims of chronic domestic abuse. While these claims were later contested by his half-brother Mike Armstrong, who described their father as a different man, the internal narrative of victimhood remained a cornerstone of John Armstrong's self-perception. This perceived abuse, whether objective or subjective, likely contributed to a profound inferiority complex and a burgeoning resentment towards figures of authority and sexual agency. During his adolescence, Armstrong maintained a surface-level normalcy that allowed him to blend into the social fabric of New Bern High School. He was described by peers and teachers as a student with no significant disciplinary problems, earning decent grades and participating in traditional activities like fishing and baseball. However, this mask of sanity was periodically challenged by intense psychological distress. At age 15, Armstrong was hospitalized for a month after locking himself in a bathroom to escape the sexual pressures of a female classmate. This incident suggests an early acute aversion to traditional sexual intimacy and a lack of adaptive coping mechanisms for social navigation. The final catalyst for his adult violent behavior occurred in 1992, following the termination of his relationship with his high school sweetheart, Kelly. Kelly reportedly left Armstrong for another individual who provided her with expensive gifts. Armstrong viewed this transition as a betrayal and began to cognitively associate the exchange of gifts or money for affection with the concept of prostitution. By dehumanizing sex workers as extensions of his personal rejection, Armstrong created a psychological framework that justified his later targeted violence.
Naval tenure, and the USS Nimitz, a global prowl.
In June 1992, seeking both education and a departure from his life in North Carolina, Armstrong joined the United States Navy. He was assigned to the USS Nimitz, CVN 68, a nuclear powered aircraft carrier that offered exactly the kind of geographical shielding and constant mobility that characterizes some of the world's most elusive serial killers. Aboard the Nimitz, Armstrong earned the nickname Opie because of his freckled face and red hair, a persona that projected innocence and dependability. Despite his Opie persona, Armstrong's internal volatility was evident to his closest associates. Rackmates described him as moody, noting that he suffered from chronic severe headaches and was prone to temper tantrums. His naval record, however, told a different story. He was a decorated sailor receiving 5 medals and 4 ribbons for good conduct and service. This duality, the decorated serviceman and the moody loner, allowed him to operate with a high degree of autonomy during the carrier's frequent international port calls.
International confessions and geographical disparity.
Following his eventual arrest in 2000, Armstrong confessed to a series of homicides committed while serving in the Navy. He claimed to have targeted sex workers in every port the Nimitz docked, stating he either killed or tried to kill every prostitute he'd ever had sex with. These confessions spanned the globe, suggesting a predatory reach that mirrored the Navy's strategic presence in the Pacific and Middle East. The veracity of these international claims has been a subject of significant debate among criminal investigators. In Seattle, Armstrong's descriptions of his victims were fluid, changing from a transsexual to a black guy who tried to bum money. Such inconsistencies led authorities in Washington to believe his claims might be fabrications intended to bolster his profile as a prolific killer. Also, Thai and Hawaiian police found no unsolved homicides matching the specific details Armstrong provided. However, the 1998 homicide of Lynette Ann Hillig in Newport News, Virginia, remains a credible point of interest for the Naval Criminal Investigative Services, or NCIS. Hillig, a 34-year-old sex worker, was killed while the USS Nimitz was based in the Norfolk Newport News area for refueling and complex overhaul. While physical evidence was insufficient to secure a conviction, the timing and victimology were strikingly consistent with Armstrong's Detroit area crimes.
The Detroit Spree, January through April 2000.
Armstrong was honorably discharged from the Navy in December 1999. He relocated to Dearborn Heights, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit, where he lived with his wife Katie and their young son. He enrolled at Schoolcraft College and appeared to be a traditional veteran transitioning back to civilian life. However, within weeks of his arrival, he began a lethal spree along Detroit's Michigan Avenue, a corridor notorious for prostitution and narcotics. In late 1999, shortly after his arrival in Michigan, Armstrong claimed his first confirmed local victim, Monica Johnson. Johnson, a 31-year-old sex worker, encountered Armstrong in his Jeep Wrangler. According to his later confession, the encounter began as a transaction on the I-94 service drive. After engaging in sex, Armstrong manually strangled her and left her body on the sidewalk in front of a secluded alley. This crime established the pattern of his Detroit activities, the use of his vehicle as a mobile crime scene, and the selection of victims from the fringes of the urban economy. On January 2, 2000, Armstrong performed a maneuver common among serial killers seeking to insert themselves into an investigation. He reported finding a body. He contacted the Dearborn Heights police, claiming he had pulled over because he was nauseated and discovered the remains of Wendy Jordan while attempting to vomit into the Rogue River. Responding officers found Armstrong at the scene with his Jeep, which bore a front license plate reading Baby Doll. While police questioned him, they did not immediately arrest him as they lacked probable cause. However, forensic technicians collected DNA from the scene and processed Armstrong's vehicle. The later DNA analysis provided a match between Armstrong and biological evidence found on Jordan's body, but the arrest was delayed several weeks while prosecutors waited for the final lab reports, a window of time during which Armstrong continued his predatory behavior. The most gruesome phase of the Detroit spree occurred in early April 2000. On April 10th, investigators discovered three bodies in a railroad yard in southwest Detroit near Military and John Crunk. The victims were Robin Brown, 20 years old, Rosemary Felt, 32 years old, Kelly Jean Hood, 34 years old. The scenes were ritualistically staged. Each woman had been strangled and left in sexually provocative positions. Armstrong later explained that his intention was to create a permanent site for sexual gratification, believing that since these women were dead, they could never leave him or reject him as his high school sweetheart had. The necrophilic staging represents a profound desire for total control over the female form, a control he felt he lacked in his interpersonal life.
Survivors, and the investigative breakthrough.
The eventual apprehension of John Eric Armstrong was not solely the result of forensic science, but also the courage of survivors who escaped his attacks in the days preceding the railroad yard discoveries. On April 2, 2000, Armstrong picked up Wilhelmina Drain. Once inside the Jeep, he attempted to strangle her, but she was able to deploy mace and flee the vehicle. 5 days later, on April 7th, Armstrong approached Devin Marcus, offering $40 for sex. During the encounter, Armstrong attempted to choke Marcus, who also managed to fight him off and escape. Marcus immediately contacted the Detroit Police Department and provided a detailed description of Armstrong and his vehicle. These survivor accounts were critical in establishing the baby doll Jeep as a target vehicle for the Violent Crime Task Force. On April 12, 2000, police arrested Armstrong for the homicide of Wendy Jordan, an arrest that coincided with the arrival of the formal DNA results from the Michigan State Police Lab.
Psychological profile and modus operandi.
Armstrong is categorized by forensic experts as an organized thrill killer with necrophilic tendencies. His modus operandi was refined and consistent, focusing on the marginalization of his victims to minimize his likelihood of immediate detection. The baby doll moniker is particularly significant. To the outside observer, a license plate with such a name might imply a soft, infantile, or even harmless persona, fitting the Opie nickname he cultivated in the Navy. In reality, this was a form of predatory mimicry, a mask of sanity that allowed him to lure victims into a confined space where he could then fly into a rage and exercise lethal force. His behavior during and after the crimes, particularly the posing of bodies, suggests that he viewed the victims not as human beings but as totems of a relationship he could finally control.
Judicial resolution and institutional status.
John Armstrong's trial in 2001 was marked by his cooperation with investigators, during which he expressed remorse and cried like a baby while detailing his crimes. His defense attempted to suppress these confessions, arguing that his psychiatric status made the waiver of his rights invalid. However, the Michigan courts determined that Armstrong was lucid and competent, and his statements were admitted into evidence. In March 2001, Armstrong was convicted of the first-degree homicide for the death of Wendy Jordan. 3 months later, on June 18, 2001, he pleaded or was found guilty in the deaths of Kelly Jean Hood, Robin Brown, Rosemarie Felt, and Monica Johnson. He was also convicted of the assaults of Wilhelmina Drain and Devin Marcus. Armstrong received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. While there was a technical sentencing error regarding the terms of years component of his second-degree homicide convictions, it had no practical effect on his ultimate sentence of life imprisonment. As of early 2026, Armstrong remains incarcerated at the G. Robert Cotton Correctional Facility in Jackson, Michigan, under the custody of the Michigan Department of Corrections, MDOC number 362407.
Societal and media legacy.
The John Armstrong case serves as a harrowing example of how a serial predator can hide in plain sight by exploiting institutional structures like the military. His ability to earn medals and maintain an honorable discharge while allegedly committing a global string of homicides highlights significant gaps in psychological monitoring within high stress environments. The case has been subject of numerous media adaptations, including the book The Baby Doll Serial Killer by B.R. Bates and Gerald Cliff, and various television documentaries such as Oxygen's Twisted Killers. These works emphasize the chameleon nature of Armstrong and the systemic failure to protect the marginalized women he targeted. Ultimately, the resolution of the case stands as a testament to the importance of forensic persistence and the indispensable role of survivor testimony in bringing hidden predators to justice.
And that is how Opie became a serial killer.
And that brings another episode of Homicide Cases to an end, as I close the file on John Eric Anderson. Join me next time where I will be opening the file on Benjamin Atkins.
Thanks for watching. If this is your kind of content, then please give me a like and follow. It will help me keep the series going. This is Misfit signing off, and as always, stay safe.